Hi there, welcome to Checkpoint Carl. Obviously, I'm Carl. My channel is going to be one that is ingrained in retro gaming, but from a view of my life and lessons learned and stories that I can share with others that I feel are important to share, as well as hopefully entertaining. And yeah, my videos will feature a arcade game or two, or not even arcade games, but any game in the background. They will have some relevance to the story at hand. I'll leave it up to you guys to figure that out. And then I'll overlay my audio and this video in smaller form, just so that there's some reassurance that I'm not AI, and I'm a real person with a real story. So my channel I'll have 2 stories per week to upload. I've got enough stories to do thousands, so I'm going to be around for a while. So rest assured there. Probably do one video midweek and one on a weekend. Haven't got set days yet, but let's say Wednesday and Sunday, my local time. I'm based in Brisbane, Australia. My stories predominantly, though, will be based from a New Zealand viewpoint because that's where I grew up. And spend all my time with retro gaming, other than obviously what I dabble in now. So first 24 years of my life were in New Zealand, and before moving over here, where I spent the next half of my life. I'm now 49. So yeah, my videos will be predominantly long form. That's what I really feel like doing, or I can't see how my stories would benefit from short form, but I'll be doing those 2 as a minimum, video-wise, every week, 2 of, and say 30 minutes a piece. Now let's get into it, okay? So these first few videos are going to be, I guess, more of an introduction to me, get a feel for me, my background, and what's going on. And then over time, there'll be probably less reference to that. And by all means, people can come back and visit older videos to get a feel for who I am, watch them chronologically, or however they want. It's all fine with me. So, yeah, right now it's time to pause, reflect, respawn. So I'll take you back to 1976 when I was born. I was born to a mother and father who clearly weren't ready to have kids. They weren't even ready to be in a relationship. I was an only child. My father wasn't around. He was around for a little while, but gone before I was sort of 2. I have no recollection of that. And so he took off to start a whole new family in the US, new life. And my mother was someone who was a drug user and a drinker. And anyway, I was only a few months old, living with my mother, sorry. I don't refer to her as a mum. Just for the record, I do differentiate a difference between a mother and a mum. A mother is how you reference on a birth certificate, references your mother and father. A mum or a dad, those are titles that are earned, in my opinion. That's what you get when you are physically there for your children and around. You become a mummy and a daddy. That's basically it. So sorry, digress a little bit, but I just wanted to clarify that because I tripped myself up there. So I live with my mother only, in a one-room unit in a small beachside town. We'll just call it the Mount for ease of reference, because the Māori names and terminology might be a bit hard for the international viewers to sort of get their head around it. Mount Maunganui, for those who that may mean something to, but a small, sleepy beachside town at that time in my childhood. It was a lot of beach batches and that sort of thing. So very relaxed atmosphere. But anyway, on this one evening, my mother was in an altered state, mental state, had called her mother, which is my grandmother, who could hear me screaming in the background. This is obviously what I've been told later by her, because I had no recollection of that 2 months old. And so my grandmother arrived at the house. My mother was passed out. I was, malnourished, dirty, hadn't been changed, and obviously screaming. And my grandmother rang, the authorities, the ambulance, but took me. And from that day on, I was in permanent custody of my grandparents. So I've no doubt that they saved my life at that point. But as you come to see by my story, my life wasn't, ideal by standards, especially in those times and in those days. So they took me in. The house consisted of my grandfather, grandmother, and occasionally my youngest of two uncles. So my mother's younger brother, Kevin, who he would have been still at high school when I first moved in there. But then obviously by the time I've got any memory of him, he was at university. And so away from home, he had a bedroom there and come back on occasion. But he was a considerable distance from home. Now, before I get into the arcade game and my introduction to arcades and how that looked, I just need to paint a picture of of the significance behind why gaming would become so important for me. Now, the house that I'd been taken into, whilst it saved me from probably death, or at least a very unpleasant and sickly upbringing, but the house was predominantly me and my grandparents. My grandfather was, from all memory I have him, was elderly and frail. He was 12 years my grandmother's senior. But he wasn't sickly, he was just older, frail. But my grandmother was sickly, so younger, but not well. And she was quite volatile. She had, anger issues and would just sort of lash out for no real reason. And discipline would be taken to a whole different level. And so what was going on there? Apologies. Radio just decided to kick in of its own volition while I was driving. So we need to pause that. Where was I? Right. So there was violence in the house, which was one reason for me to want to get out of the house environment. I was lonely. So they were older. I was left to my own devices much of the time. I looked forward to my uncle coming back, but it was fleeting, and it was, he was young, so even when he was back, there was a lot of time he wanted to go and hang with his friends, and late teens, early 20s. That would have been normal. So I was a lonely kid, and we were extremely poor. So whilst my grandparents actually owned the house that we lived in, I was told many years later that it was the sixth home built in that area. at a time when it would have been, dirt roads, horse cart, very few automobiles. So we're talking like, it would have been like 50s it was built. And so the time I came along, even though they owned it, it was an old home, and it was in a lot of disrepair. Um, and it had a dirt driveway compared to every other house around, which had a cemented driveway and proper entry and exit point to the road, where ours was just still curb. And saying that, didn't have a car. My grandfather was able to drive, I think, up until I was about 7. I remember there being a car around, like an old creamy looking Cortina. And but then of an age where he either lost his license or didn't pursue to keep it. So for the majority of my childhood, there were no cars. But yeah, so being poor was another one. So I had a few reasons to just get out. I guess the violence in the house and the loneliness were the main two. Being poor isn't really a reason to want to get out, but you'll soon find a connection in my story with that. And so now getting on to where gaming comes along and my actual introduction to video games and arcades came about from my uncle. And whether he realised it or not at the time, I don't think he would have. He was young enough, and obviously being at university, that he would have been into video games himself. And he was. So in their free time in Palmerston North, where he was studying, they would have had video games for him to play. And so within fairly short distance from where we lived, it would become push bike distance for me as a child. I was getting around on my own or with friends. But this time it was by scooter that my uncle used to get around on when he was home. And we went down to a local fish and chip shop. Can't remember what we got, probably a burger and a milkshake. But what I do remember is the arcade machines that were there. And this was my introduction to arcade machines. So I would have been 6. As behind as New Zealand was with other things like cinema releases, in particular, being a month's out from when they were released in the UK or the US, ironically, arcade games machines were coming out at launch pretty much. And so at 6, like we're looking at 1982, 83 probably, or so around 82, 83 when I went down there for the first time. And my uncle was a fairly keen player of 2 of the 3 games that were in this fish and chip shop. So they had Gallagher, which my uncle played and was good at. They had Time Pilot, which he was also good at. And then they had Frogger. Didn't see him play that too often, although I would come and play all 3. And so that was my introduction to arcade games. Still too little to really play them from my own height and see the screen properly, even on tippy toe. So I remember my uncle wedging me on his knee to get, sort of pushed into the machine high enough to play. And but it wouldn't be too long before I could just reach and see those controls on my own. Those games stayed at that fish and chip shop easily for a good couple of years. They got one extra at one point, would have been a couple of years, almost at that 2-year point, which was, I think it was Phoenix from memory. But the other 3 there, they were there for a longer period of time. So, yeah, that was my introduction to arcade games and any form of video game. And why do I suggest that video game or arcade games in particular saved my life at that point? Well, it's because thankfully where I grew up, it was sleepy, it was community driven. environment. I had friends that were all a stone's throw away from my house. I was a stone's throw away from the school, large hockey field that we could run around and play in, play cricket, play soccer, rugby, whatever. And it was these friends that I would go and visit to do regular outdoor stuff, jumping our bikes, bike around, In those days, like schools and kindergartens weren't locked out to the public, so we had free rein going in there and using their playgrounds, biking around, playing tag, hide and seek, whatever we wanted. Literally, the neighbourhood was ours. But this set of shops, where that fish and chip shop was within biking distance, and there were a couple of friends of mine that we were allowed to venture that far. And so we would bike to this this fish and chip shop with arcade machines to play these games. And what these games created for me, which I didn't realise was missing at the time, this is years later and I can reflect back on it. But I wouldn't say I was of an overly high competitive nature when it came to those arcade games, but I did like seeing my initials on the scoreboard for any of those games. And so there was a little bit of, friendly rivalry and just trying to get first place over our friends, mostly on Gallagher and Time Pilot. And so there was an extra, form of something that was missing from me at home, maybe even from school, and from regular play with your friends, you don't get it. And that was a level of accomplishment. I felt like I was achieving something by getting a high score and getting my initials on there. Now, in those days and where I lived, it wasn't really a thing to jump on the phone and call your friends first. Did on occasion, but not usually. The rule of thumb was to just jump on your push bike and go from house to house. Now, I never had friends come to my house because I had nothing, and I was embarrassed, being as poor as I was and scruffy as I was. I was more inclined to go to my friend's house and pick them up and go and play somewhere, or go to the shops and get some 1, 2 and 5 cent lollies and play a few video games, arcade games. But there were times when they weren't available, they weren't home, or they were doing family stuff, and I was on my own. And so if I had the money, I would go down to the local shop and play a few games. But even if I didn't have money, I would go down there and potentially watch strangers play, or just stand at the machine at the game over, insert coin screen, pretending I was playing. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but I needed that escapism. I needed somewhere to go, a reason to be. And even if I put myself in the shoes of parents or adults that would have been looking at me as that child, I'd be heartbroken, actually. I'd be sad to see a little kid without shoes, scruffy, clearly poor looking, at a video game with game over across it. So no money, clearly, but nowhere else to be, no one else around. But I didn't see that at the time. I just needed somewhere to be. And that's why arcade games would become a savior for me. Get me away from somewhere that was not good for me, not good for my health, not good for my mental health. And I would hate to think of where I would be now had it not been for video games. So it would only be another couple of years before my uncle was back from study and around more frequently. he then went to work for the council um, in the nursery. That's what he studied, horticulture at the time. And so had a few more, arcade game sessions with him from time to time. I got to see a few different places where games were located. It soon became apparent that, amazingly, for such a sleepy town and in a country that was normally behind the eight ball in those days, man, there was a plethora of video games, arcade games everywhere. But from 9, I would also get my first paper run. Very short, simple run, advertisement sort of papers. But it would soon become a local mainstream paper. And then by 11, 12, I would also have a milk run. So I found a way of getting my own pocket money. That, yes, all went into video games, pretty much. Well, no. Video games, candy, the occasional milkshake. But that was fine. That's all I needed. So by that stage, I could venture further by bike, as could my friends. Only one other of them had a paper run such as me. But everyone had pocket money of some description from doing chores or whatever they did around the house, or they were just given it. So more often than not, I had something to use when we went out somewhere. And even if not, I still tagged along. I would often find that my friends would still, shout me a game here or there, and that was fine. I just liked being there in that environment and with them, even if I didn't have any money. But part of the adventure became jumping on our bikes and actually finding these locations. Some of them became staple locations, I found a mini arcade, which housed about 10 games. Found a laser tag place, which came out around that. It was a new thing around that time, but again, had its own little mini arcade with about 12 to 14 machines. And then you'd find them popping up around the place, like sporting venues, soccer club, indoor cricket, hamburger bars and fish and chip shops were staples. Some of them even had those little cocktail machines over time. They were all uprights at that point, but over the years, the cocktail machines, the sit-down ones, would start to crop up over a few and far between, but they were around. And with a plethora of games everywhere came a plethora of game types. A lot of the games weren't repeated around the place either, so if you wanted to play a particular game that you liked or you were getting into at that time, you would have to venture to that particular destination. It wouldn't be repeated at the arcade or at a hamburger shop or wherever, burger joint. It would be one of wherever it was, which is also quite cool. And so my friends and arcade machines became a staple in our upbringing and what we were doing. But for me, it was more than that. Yes, gaming should be fun, and for us at that time in life, gaming was also a passion. It was so fresh, so new, so vibrant, and even relatively low cost in the scheme of things, considering how poor I was. But it was, for me, it was a need, not a nicety, not a want. But I needed to have some place I could always go and always feel, I don't know, felt like a home away from home. No matter where the games were, I could be there. Money or no money, as sad as it may have looked to other people, I was happy to be in that space. I needed that escape. And I needed that friendship. There's an extension to this story, which then starts leading into personal computers and consoles uh, in the family homes, which would even further save me on my journey. I would learn a lot that I otherwise never would have been witness to, because my home was lonely, it was dysfunctional, it wasn't like every other house. You know, I look back on it, and there was only at that young age, like before entering sort of mid-teens, there was only 2 friends that I had where the parents were no longer together, but predominantly their time was with their mum, and they still saw their dad, who was close by. They just weren't living in the same house. But the majority, like 80%, were with both a mum and dad and had siblings. None of them were living with their grandparents. None of them were separated from their parents. None of them were as poor as me. It's one thing that used to stick with me and nag at my mind a fair bit, and that was, why am I so different? Why does it have to be this way? But even though it nagged at me, ultimately, and thankfully, my personality tended to sort of shrug it off, and I just went, well, this is just how it is. It's the way it is. And I dreamed and I longed for something different. I wasn't always going to be like this. I would strive to make a difference, catch up, and at least sort of be on a more level playing field with my friends. It would end up taking some time, but I would get there. So anyway, I'll leave this story at that point, because I'm not sure if venturing too much longer per story or per video is a good idea. Obviously, I will weigh this up over time, and if people are happier to have like a 60-minute story, I could do that. But I think I'm best to break it up, because I know for me personally, even though I've got the commute time to make my stories work longer, when it comes to me and entertainment and what I can absorb, you know, my life's still pretty busy. So I'm probably lucky if I have half an hour time to listen to something or watch something. So, but I do thank you for being here. I do reassure you the fact that I'll be around long term. So there'll be a continual storyline coming from me. And I'm not AI. I know that's a huge thing that's impacting stuff at the moment, and I'm probably coming on to YouTube at such an unusual time. But I figure I'm genuine. My life is mine. My story is mine. My insights are mine, and they may not benefit anybody. But it's not something that AI, at least right now, they can't pluck that out of thin air and become me. So anyway, won't hold you guys up any longer than need be. So thank you for joining me for that bit of a pause, a reflection, and in some ways a respawn. And we'll catch you. Bye for now.